Okay, let's say our La'asok B'di Rei Torah blessing together. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu
Melech Olam,
Ha'olam
Asher,
Asher Tanu B'mitzvotav V'tzivanu
Anu,
La'asok B'di Rei Torah.
Torah.
Praise to you, Lord our God, rule of the universe, who has made us holy with your commandments and command us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So, I'm going to do a review of the parts of the story that we talked about around the time of Purim. We had to stop going through the story then because we were running into the pre-Passover classes and those could not be rescheduled. So now we are revisiting Esther for Purim in July. We begin with a bus picture. This is from a year ago, a little more than a year ago when I was in Jerusalem. And the bus that I was on was stopping at Esther Hamalka Street, Queen Esther Street. So the story of Esther continues to play out today, if minimally in a street name in Jerusalem. That is this picture. You can reach it on this number 74, 75, and 7 buses. It's in the Talpiot neighborhood. So in our prologue, we have King Ahasuerus, King Ahasuerus, who's in charge of the Persian Empire. He throws a massive party and he orders his wife Vashti to come and appear before all the men wearing her crown. It does not say wearing only her crown, that is a commentary. But given how much wine everybody was drinking, according to the text, nonetheless, showing up in her crown for everybody to admire her beauty, per verse 11, she decided against taking up this request, and the king didn't want other women to think that they could get away with saying no to their husbands. So he said that she should no longer appear before the king and that somebody else should become queen instead. Does not say she was executed. She might not even have been banished, but merely gone to the royal harem. Either way, she's not the queen anymore. So that is chapter 1 in a nutshell. I refer to that as the prologue of the story because Queen Esther is not in that part of the story. Act 1, chapter 2. The king decides that he wants a queen, and so he has all the beautiful young virgins sought out, and everyone gets an audition, and he decides he likes Esther the best, so she becomes queen. And her older cousin, practically an uncle, who has adopted her because her parents died, Mordecai, he is in the palace gate. He hears Bigtan and Teresh, who are two of the king's bodyguards, planning to assassinate the king. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king in Mordecai's name. It gets written down, and the plot is foiled. Yes. Act 2. Haman's the king's advisor, and Mordecai does not bow down to Haman when everybody else does. Something I didn't notice until this year is that the other courtiers of the king ask Haman why does he not bow down. Sorry, ask Mordecai why he doesn't bow down, and he continues to not bow down. So then the courtiers tell Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai would keep this up, since they told him he was Jewish. And then Haman notices, and then he gets upset. Had the courtiers not said anything, it's entirely possible that this whole story might not have happened. So, little known detail that I hadn't noticed until this year. Perhaps you already had noticed it, but I bring it to your attention. All right. So, Haman decides he wants to kill all the Jews. He casts lots, and the word for lot in Persian is poor. So, one poor, two purim. So, Purim is basically lottery day. And Haman says to the king, there's a certain people who are scattered everywhere and they don't just do what everybody else does. And I think we should get rid of them. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the royal treasury. King said, sure, do whatever you want. The money and the people are yours to do as you see fit. And so Haman writes a decree and stamps it with the king's stamp, and everybody finds out about what's going on. Act 3, Chapter 4. Mordecai gets very upset. He puts on his own sackcloth and ashes. He can't go into the palace, but he can sit outside the palace gate wearing that. And so Esther's maidens tell her that Mordecai is not wearing his usual clothes. She sends some clothing to Mordecai, but he doesn't do it, and he doesn't put it on. And then Hatach engages in shuttle diplomacy, where he goes back and forth between Mordecai and Esther, and Mordecai tells him about the decree, which apparently Esther had not heard about. And then, let's see. Oh, and Mordecai asked Hatach to ask Esther to go to the king and have him change the law. Esther tells Hatach to tell Mordecai that if you're not invited to talk to the king and you go anyway, you might get killed. And she hasn't been invited to talk to the king, her own husband, for the last 30 days. So Mordecai sends a message to Esther that don't imagine that you will be saved just because you're in the palace. Deliverance will come from somewhere else, but you will have problems, and maybe this is the reason why you became the queen. So Esther sends back a message to Mordecai: go assemble all the Jews, fast on my behalf, and my maidens will also fast, and then I will go to the king, and if I die, I die. And so Mordecai does that. Chapter 5, Act 4. Esther talks to the king. King decides that he's happy to see her, does not have her killed. And he asks what she'd like. She invites him and Haman to a party. The king loves parties. So he is very happy to do this. Haman is happy to do this. He likes power. And the king asks Esther what she'd like, and she says she'd like them to come to another party. Fabulous. Everybody's very happy about this. And then Haman sees Mordecai not bowing down before him when Haman's on his way home. So he goes home and talks to his wife Zeresh and says that says how he's been invited to this party again, but this doesn't mean anything to me because Mordecai is still sitting there. So Zeresh suggests that the king or that Haman should have a stake put up and have Mordecai killed on it. But since he happens to be the gatekeeper, you should probably check with the king before you have the gatekeeper killed. And so Haman is very happy with this idea, and he has the stake put up. Act 5, Chapter 6. That night, the kings can't sleep, quite possibly because of all the noise from the stake being built. So he orders the history book to be read. He finds out that Mordecai had revealed this plot about Bigtan and Teresh wanting to assassinate the king. And so he asks what had been done for Mordecai. The answer is nothing. At that moment, Haman comes in. He wants to have Mordecai killed. So the king asks Haman what should be done to somebody the king wishes to honor. Haman assumes it's him, so he suggests that the man should be put on one of the royal horses, wearing royal clothing and a royal crown, and one of the courtiers should lead the man around saying, "This is what is done to the man the king wishes to honor." King says, "Great, go do that to Mordecai." Haman's not really happy about this, but he doesn't have much of a choice. So he does that, and then he goes home and tells his wife Zeresh everything that has happened. And Zeresh says, if Mordecai happens to be Jewish, then you might have some problems. And as she's saying this, messengers come to get Haman to come to the second party. And that is where we left off several months ago. So, would you read Esther chapter 7, please?
So the king and Haman came to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, the king again asked Esther at the wine feast, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Queen Esther replied, "If your majesty will do me the favor, and if it pleases your majesty, let my life be granted me as my wish, my people at my request. We have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, massacred, and exterminated. Had we only been sold as bondmen and bondwomen, I would have kept silent. For the distress, is not worthy of the king's trouble. Thereupon King Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who is he and where is he who did do this?" "The adversary and enemy," replied Esther. "Is this evil Haman?" And Haman cringed in terror before the king and the queen. The king, in his fury,
at the top.
They're at top 7.
Left the wine feast for the palace garden, while Haman remained to plead with Queen Esther for his life. For he saw that the king had resolved to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet room, Haman was lying prostrate on the couch on which Esther reclined. "Does he mean," cried the king, "to ravish the queen in my own palace?" No sooner did these words leave the king's lips, and Haman's face blanched. Then Harvana, one of the lieutenants on the king, said, "What is more at stake at standing at Haman's house? 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, the man whose word saved the king. Impale him on it," the king ordered.
In the middle. Verse
Oh,
10.
the last sentence.
The king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the stake she had brought for Mordecai, and the king's fury abated. Context. This is chapter 7 of the biblical book of Esther 1. What might Esther be thinking during any part of this chapter?
Thank you. All right, so it's a busy chapter. What might Esther be thinking at any part of this chapter?
She had to be feeling a great deal of stress at this moment, making this request of a king quite audacious, but she's taking a lot of risks. Plus, it seems like Haman's right there listening to all of this.
What else might she be thinking?
And
You're
she felt
absolutely.
that she felt this was her time to be able to speak up to save everyone. It was a good opportunity.
I'm also wondering to myself, is she surprised that one of the eunuchs is telling about a kind of a stake on which to hang her Mordecai? I don't know if she knew that before.
I think her mind was just racing because everything happened so, everything just happened so at once, and she's probably like her heart is racing, her mind is racing. She's like, okay, what's going on now? That's what I believe.
What I find interesting is when you think of the last two chapters that we went through in the last 2 weeks, they were about Lashon Hara. And that they were about, and we were talking about from Korach, from the spies, from Miriam, the power of speech. And that's a lot of what this has been going on with this. I wouldn't have thought it relevant to this time of year.
Yeah, Lashon Hara is literally the evil tongue, but it's used to mean gossip, speaking badly about people or things. Absolutely.
Apparently, some scholars have found some evidence in the history of Persia that this may not be totally a made-up story, that while the details may be customized for the Hebrew Bible, that apparently there is some trace of record in the long history of Persia that there were palace intrigues, and that at one point a prime minister got too big for his britches and tried to put on the airs of the king and paid for it. So the people who were giving this presentation weren't in a position to prove from Persian documents that this all actually happened, but they said that it was intriguing that modern scholarship had apparently tracked down at least a kernel of reference that backs up some of these details in the Book of Esther.
Well, it's not uncommon in many organizations or even governments in some parts of the world today that there are intrigues. What happens? How many times have we seen someone being put out of power in a nefarious way, some violent way? Which, well, in a certain sense, we saw this past Saturday. Oh, this person might be deranged, but it happens. Sometimes it's done politically in a peaceful way. Sometimes there's pressures or look what happens in Russia. You just make up things and you continue to justify being in power. In other places, people will invent something to try to justify taking over. You see that in well, what's going on in South America, what's going on in Venezuela, Ecuador, other places. And if I were Esther and I were thinking about all this, I'd say, what do I do? Do I take the gamble? I just sort of avoid anything, or I run the risk, or I roll the dice and see if the king will receive me, and how do I manage the situation? to see if we can't salvage something. And then how do I manage it? How do I just set up the circumstances without appearing to be let the information fall out on its own without her just being the one that's accusing somebody and they can deny it.
I think that Esther could be thinking how fickle the king is and how transient the state of the Jews is. State of the Jews are, because on one hand, 1 minute the king is signing a decree on behalf of Haman to let him do whatever he wants with the Jews, and look what it exposed us to. And then on the other hand, now Esther has the pendulum swinging toward her, and Haman is on the ropes. And then Esther could be thinking back about how she got there in the first place as a part of the thought process, and how Vashti is queen 1 minute, and in the next minute she's vanquished, whether she's alive or dead, she's out. I think she'd be thinking this king is sways to the wind, and this one moment's terror is another moment's glory, and is another moment's possible terror again. So she must be thinking with Mordecai, we better act while the acting is timely and take care of this situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She must have taken an incredible risk to go against Haman, because Haman had the power, the wealth, the influence, and the hatred of Mordecai to build the stake that was 75 feet tall, because a cubit's about a foot and a half. So just think about how tall that was, what it must have taken to construct it, and the hatred that he had that must have been driving him to do that.
And yeah, being impaled is not pleasant either. And how do you get him up?
Not even thinking about that as a
The
punishment.
form of torture is
I thought it was hung.
the privacy of the form of torture is even emphasizes and accentuates the hate, for sure.
The term taluhu could be is more often hanging, but biblical scholars think that in this context it means impaled. However, it's gruesome enough to tell children that we are hanging people. It's even worse to talk about impaling them.
Even if it was a gallows, I mean, a 75-foot gallows is still immense.
And this was his wife's idea, right? Was it Zeresh's idea?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yep.
So in other words, if your wife gives you bad advice, don't take it. Unless you're very fortunate you married someone who was as smart as mine is.
I say.
Least I can do.
One thing I've always thought about this story is how fast this turns around and how fast we're just like, oh, it's revealed and he's gone. Haman's gone. And it's just that sort of, it's interesting, just the difference in say modern storytelling versus the ancient one, in which I think this would have been drawn out a little bit more than have it such a fast turnaround like that.
All right, next question. What might Esther be feeling during any part of this chapter? So we have thinking, and now I'm going to ask you about feeling.
Praise the God of the Hebrews. He's given us a moment of deliverance here. Seize the opportunity.
Other thoughts about what she might be feeling at any point during this?
I know why she was. Why two parties?
That's a question people have been wondering about for 2,000 years.
And still they do.
And still they do. Welcome to the conversation.
Good.
I'll throw it out to you guys. Why two parties?
Maybe Haman didn't feel so threatened. He said another invitation. He feels more comfortable. They enjoy my company so much, and then she springs a trap once he feels comfortable and he's not maybe so much on the defensive. Okay.
If I may, maybe the first party she used to observe the dynamics between Achashverosh and Haman, and the second party was based on an observation as opposed to a wild guess in the first place. Maybe. Just saying.
Makes sense.
Based on what Barry said, perhaps this is some kind of like counter intrigue against Haman, or part of that generally, to sort of maybe scope out how many people in the Persian court are really his allies, maybe even to see what reasons those people might be aligned with Haman, perhaps to see, for some, is it a power thing? Is it because they've been threatened? Perhaps to sway them, maybe? The other courtiers, maybe? To her side?
But if he already told her he would be able to do it, he would give her anything. She could have accomplished all that in the first party.
That's true. So the great thing about Midrash, which you guys have just created the world's newest Midrashim, is that as long as you don't go against anything explicitly stated in the text, there aren't really wrong answers. You can take it in a whole range of directions as long as the text doesn't contradict what you're saying. which, as we've determined, the text is light on details in some ways. So this is how midrashim and commentaries are born. Somebody has a question about something in the text, and then they try to come up with an answer. And while some people have very famous responses, like Rashi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yitzchak, who lived in the 1000s and early 1100s, I think, in France, you have as much information as Rashi had from the text itself. He might have known other people's thoughts more than you do, but everybody's working off the same text, basically. So feeling like you can be part of the conversation is one of the great things for me about studying Jewish text. Yes, if we know what somebody else has said, we should respect it, but that doesn't mean that we should feel like we can't be part of the conversation just because they entered the conversation 1,000 years before we did. So I'm glad that you all have wrestled with this, whether out loud or in your heads, because this is how one of the ways that Jews interact with text is to ask questions and then try to come up with answers. Okay, let's go to chapter 8, because there are more problems ahead. Alan, would you read chapter 8, please?
Sure. That very day, King Ahasuerus gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai presented himself to the king, for Esther had revealed how he was related to her. The king slipped off his ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's property. Esther spoke to the king again, falling at his feet and weeping and beseeching him to avert the evil plotted by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. If it please your majesty, she said, and if I have won your favor and the proposal seems right to your majesty, and if I am pleasing to you, let dispatches be written countermanding those that which were written by Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, embodying his plot to annihilate the Jews throughout the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, I have given Haman's property to Esther, and he has been impaled on the stake for scheming against the Jews. And you may further write with regard to the Jews as you see fit. Write it in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet. For an edict that has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet may not be revoked. So the king's scribes were summoned at that time on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, and letters were written at Mordecai's dictation to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors, and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Nubia, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. He had them written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet. Letters were dispatched by mounted couriers riding steeds used in the king's service, bred of the royal stud. To this effect, the king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any people or province attacks them, they may destroy, massacre, and exterminate its armed force, together with women and children, and plunder their possessions. On a single day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. The text of the document was to be issued as a law in every single province. It was to be publicly displayed to all the people so that the Jews should be ready for that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, mounted on royal steeds, went out in urgent haste at the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in the capital Shushan. Mordecai left the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white, with a magnificent crown of gold and a mantle of fine linen and purple wool. And the city of Shushan rang with joyous cries. The Jews enjoyed light and gladness, happiness and honor, and in every province and in every city, when the king's command and decree arrived, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday, and many of the people of the land professed to be Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Okay, this is chapter 8 of the biblical book of Esther. What might Esther be thinking during any part of this chapter? What might Esther be feeling during any part of this chapter?
Thank you. All right. So this is sort of like the epilogue of the story as it is usually taught. So what might Esther be thinking or feeling at any part of this chapter?
Well, I mean, she must have felt triumphant that this wonderful thing was going to happen to save all the Jews.
I think she must have been feeling really good, but in the back of her mind, she's thinking, well, maybe the word isn't going to get out quite in time, and maybe the Jews really won't be saved.
I'm thinking that Esther must be thinking that what's done's been done, her life's purpose is fulfilled. That was quite a competition to win the favor of the king and, be the king's consort and become queen. She overcame a lot of odds to get to the top, and now she's done what she was supposed to do.
This is one of those it ain't over until it's over situations because of what we heard a little bit earlier in chapter 8, that the king's edicts, when signed in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet, are not revocable. They can only be countermanded by a subsequent edict, and if that's the case, then you could have factions arguing against each other which edict is the heart of the king or not, or which one has the political power or not. I think it's all up to the fighting, and I think Esther is realistic enough to know that, and so is Mordecai. I think the battle has to take place, and we have to prevail. And she doesn't know that until it actually happens. That's my thought.
based on that, perhaps she's also very frustrated that she lives in a society that has been organized in such a way where this is even possible. Maybe she is dreaming of a better Persia that doesn't have these sort of systemic issues. And maybe she's thinking for next steps, not only like how do we deal with further problems, but how do we also like make sure they don't happen again.
Could we go back for a couple of verses? Because I think she must be frustrated by the fact that what she asks of the king, the way it's translated here is that he countermand the evil decree from Haman. I think that's the Lihashiv. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. It's in verse 5. If I'm pleasing in his king's eyes, will he send out letters that will countermand or annul the letters of Haman to cause the Jews to be annihilated? And then it's a little hard to see it here because it's translated with a different word in English. But in verse 7, the king says, well, write whatever you want, but what was written with the king's, that was signed, written in the king's name and sealed with his signet may not be revoked, Lahashiv. So he's telling her, and it does sound ridiculous. I'm the all-powerful king, and we talked about this a few months ago, but in this context, I'm the all-powerful king, but I can't even revoke my own prior orders. You'll have to, I'll just empower you to go out and have a slaughter instead of revoking my previous letters. That to me is I don't know if it's parody of Persian kingship or whether it has some historical basis, which I'd be surprised, but it's very odd that she wants him to cancel the decree. And he says, well, I can't do that, but we'll do this other thing. So we'll have a great bloody a slaughter.
And surely that bloody slaughter wouldn't make him very popular, you would think, as opposed to just countermanding the order, which does seem like that would be it's an unfortunate aspect of that system, right? Weird.
Systems are such. Could have been his father's system or his father's system. I mean, who knows? Royalty is such that you'd have to know what the line is to know why it's there, but it was there.
Right, but if you think about it, that's actually such a odd limitation of power to have, that you can't countermand anything that's been done before. That actually kind of limits the space in which you can operate quite vastly.
I think that's a fiction.
Yeah.
Because if the king is sovereign, then he should be able to undo his prior decisions, unless somebody's already been, hanged. But so far as one can, but that's the way the story is told, and that gives the basis for the Jews to go out and slaughter people.
Right, but the line up.
That's my response.
But the line above there, it uses the word countermand. Let's dispatches be written countermanding those that were written. If you're countermanding, you're canceling.
It's this, yes, and here it says revoked in the next verse. That's why I said it's a little misleading because it's the same. That's why I was asking David if it looks to me like it's the same Hebrew word.
Yeah.
So they somehow soften that in the translation. I don't know why, but it makes the king look, really ridiculous. I mean, in Great Britain, the king in Parliament is said to be sovereign. Parliament can't bind future parliaments, and here the king can't even. The king can bind himself, which leaves him powerless once he's made a foolish decision to undo it.
Yeah, I think your thought that maybe this is some sort of parody sort of there's other aspects of the king's behavior that sort of lend itself to that interpretation too. I mean, just like how changeable he is. Basically, the last person that talks to him, he'll do whatever that person says to him, right? Like, it does seem that maybe that parody aspect is part of it. Yeah, for sure.
It's certainly not original with me, but it comes out in these different places. Yes.
Well, I was also struck by the ferocity, which they said, well, not only fight to defend themselves, but to wipe out women and children. And that's going beyond well, who knows? Maybe that's the same as what they're planning to do to the Jews. So
That's also biblical, though. It's certainly in the command of Amalek, wipe them all out. Shaul lost his throne because he didn't wipe out cattle to slaughter for the people, and he wiped out all the men, but not everybody else, and so not all of everybody else, and he was still lost his throne over that. And when God tells us to cross the Jordan, he says, wipe out your enemies, wipe those people out, and crash all their altars and all that kind of thing. It's like, and if you don't, they'll be like thorns in your eyes, things like that. So it's not.
The next generation.
This wipe them out before. Yeah.
But today, I'm not going to talk about today's politics, but that doesn't sound like something. You can see what's happening in the Middle East right now with Israel, and then what some of the reactions are. And amongst ourselves, so I don't want to go down that path of current events, because we may not all share the same viewpoint.
But you have to be very careful looking at yesterday's events through today's lens.
Yes.
Good point.
It seems to me that part of the whole point of the Book of Esther is to be a parody of a whole bunch of things, not the least of which is the, let's politely say, the awkwardness of Persian palace life as opposed to the way the Jews were living their communal life. When you think of it as a broader parody.
Oh, you did yourself.
I'm sorry. I apparently I was muted while I was saying all that. Let me repeat myself. It is a larger parody than just what it appears on the surface. It almost feels like a contrast between highfalutin Persian palace life and the much more real, so to speak, life of Jewish governance in the land of Israel. I think one thing that would probably throw more light on this is if we had more information about who we think wrote this, when it was written, what else was going on in the world around them when it was written. But it doesn't surprise me that it savages both King Ahasuerus and Haman in the same document. I think that may have been part of the whole purpose of the Book of Esther, was to really thumb their noses at the way Persian royalty was operating in the world. Just my thoughts.
All right. So recognizing the time, I'm going to stop the share and see if I can stop the chat or stop the recording. Recording stopped.